The 2015 Polyglot Gathering is brought to you by italki. Become fluent in any language.
Nobody gets people going, actually, when I start singing. My dulcet tones. Okay. So thank you all for coming. I feel very lucky to have so many people in the room. So some of you are probably sitting in this audience thinking, I'm not a native speaker of English. What the hell am I doing here? Hands up if you fall into that category. Oh, actually. Okay. Not as many as I thought. So they've probably all gone to somewhere else more interesting. So in case you didn't recognize me, this is me. My name's Richard Simcott, for those of you who don't know who I am. And I quite like languages. And that's why I'm here today. These are a few of the things that I'm engaged in online, speaking fluently. The Facebook page is probably more active. And the Polyglot Workshops and Polyglot Conference, which I'm sure some of you in the room may have heard of. But my story today about learning language as a native English speaker doesn't actually just hold true for speakers of English as a native language. It actually goes beyond the borders of other countries as well, where there's a dominant single language and they don't tend to learn many other languages or any other languages. So hopefully there'll be relevance in this for other people. The idea and the goal for me is to actually explain some of the difficulties in learning languages for people from these countries, particularly from my experience as a native English speaker from the United Kingdom. And I hope that it will help to make people understand and be more aware of those difficulties so that they can help language learners when they're speaking to them. So that's the goal for me for this talk. But let me just demonstrate what I mean by this not being true just for native English speakers and for other people, with a little story. So a Spanish man walks into a clothes shop in London and he goes, he wants to buy some socks. So he walks in and he says, "Hola, buenos días. Quiero comprar unos calcetines, por favor." He's from the south of Spain. And the shopkeeper looks at him and goes, "I'm so sorry, sir. I don't understand what you're talking about." It's very posh. And the Spanish guy is like, "Quiero comprar unos calcetines, por favor." Speaking now a little bit more clearly. And the English guy looks at him and goes, "Well, it's a clothes shop, so he's going to want clothes, isn't he?" So he comes back with a shirt and he goes, "No, no, 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 no. Eso es una camisa. Yo quiero calcetines, por favor." So he goes, "Okay, obviously wrong." So he comes back with a pair of trousers. No, 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 no. Esos son pantalones. Yo quiero calcetines, por favor. So he goes back again. Eventually he comes back with a pair of socks and he goes, "Eso sí que es." And he goes, "Well, you bloody knew how to spell it in English. Why didn't you do that in the first place?" So, as you can see, this isn't a thing just for the native English speakers. So, one thing that we always hear is, what do you call somebody who speaks many languages? What do we call them? Oh yeah, first one up. That was very good. Who would have known you'd have said that first? Or multilingual? Or Luxembourgish? Right? Representing the Luxembourgers. How many in the room? There we go. They don't need to be here, they're already experts. What do you call somebody who speaks 2 or 3 languages? Oh, there we go, look at this. Bilingual. It's like you wrote these slides, it's amazing. Okay, there we go. Thinking manzana, but saying apple. And what do you call someone who speaks 1 language? I love it. It's like he wrote these. Seriously? Australia. And there's a lovely flag that I found. Thank you, Google. Okay, so, but why do English natives find it so hard to learn language? Why is that a problem? Well, through this presentation, I wanted to discuss the following things: grammar, vocab, accent pronunciation, practice, picking a language. Oops. And we'll start with grammar, but let's just not do that quickly. Whoa. So these are all aspects of what make it difficult. And as I say, this applies not just to native English speakers, but to other people as well, people who are native speakers of other languages. But why? Why is this a problem? Well, from my point of view, speaking as a native English speaker, born and raised in the United Kingdom, grammar is a problem because in English we don't have gender in the same way as we do in other languages. So when you get to le, la in the French lessons, and people say the wrong gender, and then you get to German, you think, okay, I've cracked this gender with French. Okay, it's l'enfant, je sais, donc un enfant, il n'y a pas de problème, hein? Mais das Kind, warum? Why is it neuter? Why is it then changed gender in German? All of this is kind of weird for native English speakers, and you often hear that they make mistakes with the gender because of this, for this reason. But this also applies to Finnish speakers, to Turkish speakers who don't have gender as well in their languages. Verbs. English speakers fluff the verbs that they already have, and they don't change that much anyway and through the pronouns. So, I see, you see, he sees. Oh, wow. Big change. But, then you get to some of the Latin languages, and the changes are huge. Veo, ves, ve, vemos, etc., etc., etc. And case. Oh, I love the reaction in the room. Who likes cases? You sick individuals. Seriously. There is something we can do for you later. It's in the back room. I think there's a talk on Esperanto. It's only got one case, so you'll be quite happy, but it will make it a lot easier. Okay, grammatical rules and terminology. When I went to university in the UK, I went to study languages. So who here thinks that language students tend to be quite good at grammatical terminology and what things mean? I'm getting nods. You see, it's the wrong audience for these things. People are going, yeah, definitely, they're all fantastic. One of the first things that they did is took us all aside and said, okay, we need to teach you English grammar because you don't get taught it in the school. In the UK, you're not taught English grammar in the same way as you're taught French grammar or German grammar. So often you'll have a better understanding of a foreign language's grammar than you will of your own. But that actually is a problem, because when you get to things like cases, if you don't know what a direct object is, then the accusative sounds really strange, or an indirect object. Or who here was taught what a verb is by saying it's a doing word? What does that mean? None of these. Or a noun's a naming word. Okay. And then you give a few examples that you need to write down in a test, right? That's it. But then you get to the vocabulary, and it's vast. It's often exotic, unless you're talking about French, and then it's basically 60% of English. And this is my picture that I took in Albania. I just want to show it off. I'm such an attention whore. It's terrible. But the idea is the vastness. You get the imagery, right? But it's vast. I mean, if you look at a language, and who has had people come up to you and you say, okay, I speak French or I speak German, they go, oh, so you know everything. Right? I get that all the time. So what's the word for this? And then they like to test you. So you then translate it. But actually what they don't realize, and what you don't realize yourself as a native speaker of a language, is that sometimes what you need to do is a sort of a mind flip when you talk about vocabulary. So you don't always have the words in the language that you're learning or the language you're speaking. Just to give you an example, I live in the Republic of Macedonia. Macedonian is my home language. But there's no word for bookmark. They sell them, they have them, but there's no real word that people that use for bookmark. There's no real word that everybody uses for chives. There are these kind of bits of vocabulary that you want to say, and then you don't really have a a word. So you have to bend your mind to express things in a way that the natives will understand. And that is one of the big stumbling blocks for native English speakers, because we're used to dominating with exact precision what we want to say and how we want to say it, and you can't always do it. The exotic thing relates to the sounds or how the word is made and whether it trips off the tongue, whether it's easy to pronounce. It can just sound weird to native English speakers. And it can be confusing because sometimes a very small change in a word means something completely different. Has anyone got any good examples of words that they've heard? There's a word for cheers in Hungarian and a word that means something very different. That's very close. Yes. What is it? Come over and speak it. Come on. Come on up. I take active volunteers. You can come up. You've just volunteered by saying it now. Here we go. I know you love this.
Egészségedre és egészségedre.
Tell the difference.
Egészségedre is cheese and egészségedre is like to spank your ass or something like that.
So that's one. Thank you, Vlad. Okay, thank you very much, Köszönöm szépen. I mean, one of the typical things I used to hear when I was at school, as a schoolboy, in French was merci beaucoup instead of merci beaucoup. So one is thank you, beautiful bum. And this leads me on to accent pronunciation. So, especially for native English speakers, but also, again, for other speakers of other languages, this is true. There's kind of a sounding weird saying these things, like saying these weird sounds, that the U sound. It sounds a bit strange, and to get it into the right word at the right time and then not overcompensate and say merci beaucoup is not always easy for a native English speaker, because they don't always relate to, okay, how do I actually use this and make it sound normal? And then when you're in a classroom environment, especially at school, you can be seen as putting on the talk. So if you're the only child, where I grew up, there was a kind of a mix of accents. But if you imagine a school in Liverpool where they're learning French, and they say, yeah, bonjour, je m'appelle Richard, je suis de Liverpool, je parle français très bien. And I've just gone over to Yorkshire, by the way, sorry. But the point is that you've got this local accent, and then if you're the only kid that goes, bonjour, je m'appelle Richard, and the other kids can start laughing at you because they think, oh my God, what are you doing? It's like you're giving up your identity. So when I talk about prestige accents and keeping your identity, it doesn't mean you sound posh and you sound sort of all highfalutin in your language. What it actually refers to is the group language, the pack language. And that is the accent, and that's the vocabulary that you use. So as soon as you move away from that, especially in a language society like the English language in the world, where we very much judge people on their accents from the standard to where they're from, it can take you away from that group, and it can make you feel isolated, or people can make you feel isolated because of it. So sometimes it's a badge that you wear with pride, this strong accent. And you think it's fun to do it, especially as kids. When we learned the numbers in French, I remember I had to go through the basics of French, even though I'd studied it as a smaller child. I had to go through it with my peers, and they got to the numbers and they were going un, deux, trois, quatre, cinq, six, huit, neuf, dix. And that was hilarious. Still is, actually. My mum came over to, actually talking on this, my mum came over to visit me in Poland when I was staying there in Poznan. And I've got into this really weird mindset of I don't see the natural English link always straight away. So who here knows Polish? Okay, so there's a place where you sell alcohol in Poland, and it'll have written alkohole, yeah? In Polish. 24 alkohole, yeah. My mum came over, who's a native speaker of English too, and monolingual, and she said, "Oh, isn't that really clever? They've called it the alcohol." So then practicing the language. So, you know, this is a thing that native English speakers have a real issue with. Everybody speaks English. Everyone. I mean, they want to speak it. They want to practice. And this can be an issue. The level of English and the target languages, language etiquette, and reactions. So just to explain some of what I've written on here. Who here has been in a situation where you want to learn the language, you go to the country, and then it goes, your Dutch is very good. So anyway, where are you from in England? Like, oké, ik spreek ook Nederlands hoor, dus kunnen we even verder met Nederlands. Hè? But they look at me and they go, yes, but I think it's probably easier in English, right? And it's not that they always want to force you to speak English, it's that they enjoy it. And sometimes as native English speakers, we forget this. And you can get offended as a native English speaker as well, because you think, oh God, they won't even let me speak. But it's not always the case. So from the one side, they're trying to make your life easier by speaking English because they know that you're not going to stress. But from the other side, you're seeing it as, wow, is my Dutch really that bad that I can't even speak to you for more than 5 minutes without you turning this conversation into English? And it leaves the English speaker feeling very sad, disappointed, and a bit embarrassed. And, oh dear, maybe I should just not bother. Everyone speaks English. And the level of English does play a part, because sometimes when I went to Poland, the level of English is generally quite low compared to, say, the Netherlands or Sweden or Norway or Iceland or somewhere like that, where I'd say the average level is a B2, upper echelons of a B2, whereas in somewhere like Poland, it's probably an A2 level. They're functional, they get by. You can go to Poland and talk to people generally, but you can quite quickly overcome, like Alex was talking about yesterday. You know, when you get to that level, you can then quite easily just speak in the target language. That's more difficult for some languages than others. And that can be intimidating. But as a native English speaker as well, we're always very used to having the upper hand. And we use this to our advantage, of course, because you can dominate a conversation very easily, because you have a rich vocabulary automatically, because if you're an educated native speaker of English, you know, you're used to learning how to debate or talk or put your points across in a very eloquent way. Whereas if you've learned English as a foreign language, then naturally it's more of a struggle to get to that stage. So as a native English speaker, you can get complacent with this ability to express yourself without any boundaries. And sometimes, actually, the practicing the language is an issue internally, because you feel restricted for all the reasons we talked about before of grammar, vocabulary, that you don't have the same domination of the language that you do in English. But then also some other things come into place. Language etiquette. Has anybody heard me talk about language etiquette before? No? So for me, there is a real strict language etiquette that goes on with learning a language or speaking a language and practicing a language. And it relates to where you are and what you're doing and who it's with. So for me personally, if I'm sitting at home in the United Kingdom and a German or a Spaniard or whoever else walks up to me and speaks to me in English, maybe a low level of English, my instant reaction is not to go, vamos a hablar en español, ¿no? Because I know how that feels from the other side. So I sit there and okay, let's speak slowly, take this slowly and help them out, because they're making an effort to speak my language. So this is the thing that native English speakers don't always get abroad, because the reactions are, what the hell are you learning my language for? This is Iceland. The people here are like, what, 300,000? You get it in all sorts of places. In Wales as well, sometimes you'll get it where people, you know, a native English speaker will learn Welsh, and it's like, but why are you speaking Welsh? It's like, you can just speak English in Wales. Some people are now, the attitudes are changing slightly, especially because of immigration and people wanting people to assimilate into the culture, so they don't know always. But the language etiquette of speaking the language of the country you're in, I think, should hold true. So when I'm abroad, I don't feel the need to have to speak English to accommodate somebody if they want to just practice their English. But I can compromise. I can be nice about it. Ja, wir sind jetzt hier in Deutschland. Ich kann auch Deutsch reden. Ich muss jetzt unbedingt nur Englisch reden. Aber mir macht das eigentlich nichts aus. Ich meine, ich spreche sowieso viele Sprachen zu Hause und das ist für mich überhaupt kein Thema. Ich meine, ich kann auch nur Englisch. So I don't really worry so much personally anymore. I used to when I was learning the languages, but now I live in Skopje with my wife and my daughter, and we speak 5 languages at home on a daily basis and then other languages outside. I don't worry so much. But I understand why people do, and it is important to show that support for people learning your language. The reactions, actually in English-speaking countries, particularly the UK, there is often a very strong reaction against speaking a foreign language. Socially, it's, I'm not going to say unacceptable, but people do have a reaction. Polish people definitely pick up on it in the UK, and a lot more reluctant then to speak Polish to somebody who's not Polish. Speaking in public as well, sometimes they feel the eyes going to them. What are you talking about? You're talking about me, aren't you? Foreigner. And I've experienced this myself, and as a native British person, you know, growing up speaking English as a first language, when my wife and I moved to the UK to live for 3 years, we've only ever spoken Macedonian at home. We've never used English. When we went out into the city, and this is my home city of Chester, and people actually almost psychological. There was a psychological barrier to refuse to believe that I was really British, because they heard me speaking Polish. Slavic language, it sounds Slavic. And the amount of people that came up to me in the UK to say, "Excuse me, which language are you speaking there?" And I'd say, "Macedonian." Oh, okay. You're not Polish then? I thought you were Polish. No, I'm actually British. And they were, "And you're speaking Macedonian because?" And people actually did this to me. It's been in the curious realms to the blatant rude realms, and it's a strange thing to see of your own country. So you think you know, people have these great reactions. Oh, you speak all these languages, it's fantastic. But sometimes the reality of speaking all these languages, it actually makes people a bit suspicious sometimes. And why would you do it? Why would you actually speak all these languages? Why would you speak it in front of me when I can't understand? And it goes back to the language etiquette as well. It's like, there's a tight sort of line to tread with these kinds of things. You know, I've had people say all sorts of things. The only language in the UK that I found got really positive reactions generally was French, because it's seen as either a cultural equal or slightly posh still. But the other languages, Spanish and German, so-so. But speaking a Slavic language was definitely, I got more negative reactions than positive, unfortunately. So that takes me to picking languages. So how do you actually pick the languages you want to speak, bearing in mind all of this, you know, thing that we're talking about, you know, pronunciation, how easy it is for you to actually learn the vocabulary, to learn the grammar, to speak it, for that to be then acceptable where you're living, to get the practice that you need. Well, sometimes the languages are picked for you. So you go to school, you start, and you have, in the UK, French, German, possibly Spanish or some other language that's quite commonly used, and they're picked for good reasons. They're quite, you know, well-spoken languages in the world and are useful for the job market later on. So there is some method to the madness. But there are also, you know, these prestige languages that you think of. You know, people talk about, I want my child to speak this really good Russian, or you get these, you know, posh private schools that will teach Japanese or Chinese because it's seen as a prestige language, in addition to the prestige language of French. And then there's heritage. So in places like Wales, you have to learn Welsh to some degree, either it's as a first language or a second language. It's I think now they've changed it so you only learn it till you're about 14 or something like that. But you have to do some Welsh because it's obviously the official language of the country next to English. But there's often a lot of stigma attached to some of these heritage languages. People don't want to seem different. So I've met people who are either from Welsh extraction who are actually very against the Welsh language. I've met people who speak languages from India or Bangladesh or Pakistan. Their parents spoke them at home, but they speak them with a very strong Yorkshire accent or other regional accent, and they become very British. And it's not that they shun the language because they use it at home, but you get these reactions of wanting to fit in. Has anyone seen East is East? It's a really good film in the UK, British film, that demonstrates this struggle between a Pakistani father and an English Yorkshire mum, and the children are sort of caught between the two cultures and like what they're speaking, and they go and they read the Quran and they learn Arabic, and but they don't take the language so seriously because I suppose they're being seen as different to the local community. And these are things that I find really quite sad, because the diversity and actually having these additional heritage things are really nice and quite good. For myself personally, I heard Welsh as a child, and I always knew I grew up with speaking English, but there were always sort of elements of Welsh put into the English as well. Like we knew "Cae dy geg," shut your mouth. You know, lovely little things like that. It's like the Irish people that learn "Poig my horn," kiss my bum. They learn all this. It's one of the first things that you learn, right, if you learn Irish. But there are other things that motivate you learning languages. I mean, even in my later stages of language learning, when I had, who has language lists that they want to learn? Oh yeah, it's that whole room, isn't it? It's a great audience for this. And you've got like Burmese, you've got so just because you can say it, Zulu, all these fantastic languages that you'll probably not learn, but you dream of it. Never in my wildest dreams did I ever put Macedonian on that list. And because of this last reason, it's like one of the best languages that I speak. Just because, now my family is half Macedonian, and we use it at home and we use it all the time. The road ahead. So the first one is the hardest, the first language. So anybody out there, I know it's like in this room, it's like preaching to the converted, right? But there are people that look on this on YouTube, look at the video, and they're struggling with their first language. And I think, bear in mind, the first one is often the hardest one to learn. And people often come to you and say, well, isn't it really easy after that? And yes, it is. No, it isn't. It is because once you've learned one, you can imagine what it's like to speak another language. And I think that mindset and that ability to consider what it is to speak another language stays with you then for further learning. And the other thing that's really important when you learn a language is language bridges are created. So when you go through the process again, grammatical terms often repeat themselves or have similarities. You can sort of associate things better. We go back to the vocabulary. It doesn't seem as vast anymore. I've learnt French, now I'm going to Spanish. Oh, okay. There's quite a lot of words here that are the same. Or even if you go to Turkish, I found lots and lots of French words in Turkish. I was like, what the hell? And the same in Russian. You get all these French words that go through because it was the English of before English times, right? It was French. So it's permeated all of these different societies in different ways, and it really helps. My advice is always, if you're a native English speaker, learn French. It helps you with English. It helps you understand English literature. It helps you to expand your vocabulary without having to work very hard, because you have French and you have a better vocabulary in your own native tongue. And it's one of the reasons I chose French as a native language for my daughter as well, because I knew that it would be really important. Taking on new languages. So when you've got all of this, you've got this new mindset, you've got all these links and bridges from the new language that you've learnt, then you don't feel so scared to take on a new language, and you can also pretend that you're no longer a native English speaker. An interesting thing actually on this, linked to some of the cultural things we talked about in the UK. My wife and I were in Scotland. I was working on the Antarctic Treaty, and we went to a restaurant, and the guy working there came over to take our order, and he had a strong accent. And at that time, Polish people only started arriving into the UK, so we weren't really clear, and we hadn't really been following, the immigration that was to follow. I think Poland had only been in the EU for a little bit of time, so it was only then possible to come over. And the guy was speaking this Slavic accent. My wife and I were speaking in Macedonian. And we said, "Excuse me, where are you from?" Because we thought maybe there's a chance he's from the Balkans. And he went, "I'm from Croatia." Dobro, brate, možemo da govorimo I tako I na naškom. We can speak our language. And he just looked horrified at us, and he went, "Ali ne razumiješ? Šta je ovo?" We couldn't understand why he didn't understand us. This Croatian guy was like, we were speaking in the language, why can't you understand us? And at first we thought maybe we were sounding too Serbian, so we were no, we crossed some sort of etiquette boundary here that we shouldn't be doing this. Okay, we didn't use the infinitive, sorry. But we we soon started to realize this guy didn't understand the word we were saying. And he went, "Actually, I'm from Poland." And then it clicked, and we went, "Why did you say you were from Croatia?" He goes, "Because I get less negative reactions if I say I'm from Croatia than Poland." Yeah, and you can use this trick, but make sure you speak the language. That's kind of the moral of the story. So if you go to a new country and you want to say, "I don't speak English," and you want to pretend, just one of my tricks was always, I'd go, "Huh? I don't understand." And then they'd either get nervous about their own level of English and then turn back to their native language. Which is a really good trick, by the way. It works really well. You just go, "Huh?" Strain, and then they may repeat it once or twice, and then if you do it 3 times, they go, "Oh my God, my English is crap." I should maybe stay with the language that he's trying to speak to me in instead. But make sure you can speak it, because if you can't, and they happen to speak the language that you claim to be a native of, eek. So, if this is going to go for, oh, there we go. There's a lovely little thing. I like this. I like bridges. They're a nice little thing to add on. I thought pictures would make you interested if what I was saying was boring. Okay, so multilingual versus polyglot. Does anybody else make this distinction nowadays? For me, these have changed in my head. Does anybody else make the distinction anymore? You make distinctions. Yeah? For me, the multilingual is the Luxembourgish person who has had to speak 3, 4 languages through necessity. They go to kindergarten in Luxembourgish, and they do primary, secondary school in French, German, French, whichever way around they do it. And they learn English because everyone learns English. And they may learn a foreign language, like they've got the largest number of immigrants from Portugal in anywhere else in Europe outside Portugal. In Luxembourg, I believe. That was the statistic 10 years ago when I first learned it. And I'm sticking with it. It's a good one. So they may have a home language like Portuguese or Serbian. There's quite a lot of Serbian speakers that moved over during the war. And so they have 4 or 5 languages just without starting. But does that make them particularly a polyglot in the way we think of polyglots in our online community? Well, the question I asked a minute ago, who here is from Luxembourg? No one answered. And I think there's one person that I have met called Christine, I think her name is, who is from Luxembourg and is in the community. But I don't come across them very often. And I think because for me, polyglot doesn't just mean speaking languages. And people often ask, how many languages is it? For me, it's not the amount of languages per se. Yes, it's speaking more than maybe 1 or 2, but beyond that, is it really important? No. It's actually this deliberate action of going forward and picking languages and learning them. That is what a polyglot is for me. It's somebody who does this deliberately and for no apparent reason. Yeah. Am I right or am I right? So we see people like these, you know, natural multilinguists from America, you know, Professor Arguelles, our very own Alex, Benny, Emanuele, Judith. Because Germany as well, pretty monolingual country. You learn a bit of English, but you don't always learn the languages. So for me, all these countries count. It's not just about English-speaking countries. Who knows who that is? Yeah, Hungarian, Catalan. Yeah, Hungaria. Hungary is also one of those countries where they tend just to speak Hungarian, right? But these are the people. Yeah, Tim. Yeah. There we go. She's there at the back. Lindsay. Luca. Moses. Steve. Susanna. David. Stu J. Yeah, Ollie. Mike Campbell. And Donovan. And these are all people from pretty monolingual backgrounds. And yeah, they may have had languages a little bit younger, they may not. But these people all went on to do something incredible with learning lots and lots of languages. These are just examples that I chose randomly because of, you know, they're known in the community. And they're faces that you will instantly recognize and maybe attach a meaning to straight away. But I could equally have used a number of faces in this room. And had the same effect. So really, that is me. And I'm happy, yes?
This may be because I'm not a native English speaker, but isn't there another aspect to multilingual versus polyglot as well? Because for me, I'm often asked in places since I speak more than one language, well, are you bilingual then?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I'm not bilingual, because bilingual or multilingual for me means that you speak all the languages equally well, whereas polyglot means you're learning and you speak them to a different degree. Is that not the distinction you make in English?
Okay, let's take another country as an idea instead of Luxembourg, because they do education in a number of languages. So if anybody didn't hear that, the argument was whether or not there are differences in levels between multilinguals and polyglots. So whether or not you would have a bilingual as a perfect bilingual, I'm guessing you mean by this, or a trilingual, perfect trilingual, or multilingual, an extension of that beyond these three languages. And I think probably maybe a better country to pick would be somewhere like India, or some African countries as well, where they will learn languages of people around, but they'll learn them for different reasons. It will be for business, for just having a coffee, trade, whatever they're doing, they'll do it for different reasons. So they don't need the same level in the language, and they can't necessarily say the same things in all of the languages either. They may not even have one mother tongue that's very strong. It may be a mixture of languages. And this happens in a lot of places outside Europe, and even in Europe as well. I know people in the Republic of Macedonia who just go in a conversation between 5 languages. And they do it because that's just the way they talk where they live. Because they'll mix Turkish in with Albanian, with Macedonian, with Serbian, and then they may know a smattering of German and whatever else. But that's why I would say they are multilingual for me, and there are different levels. So I wouldn't make that distinction myself. If you talk about other languages like French, bilingue, everyone's bilingue in French. If they speak about 3 words of English, they're bilingue. I remember people saying that all the time. Ah, tu es bilingue? D'accord. Moi aussi, hein? Okay. So which one of your parents is from the UK? Oh, non, je l'ai appris à l'école. Okay, so you're bilingue, you're that bilingue. And there's nothing wrong with being bilingue in that way, but it's not what in the English term bilingual, it's not what we understand. We understand and assume that it's a perfect bilingualism. But actually, even in these countries where it seems like a very good bilingualism, almost perfect, it doesn't take long to scratch the surface as a very competent, fluent speaker of a language to see that it's not quite the reality, even for the people that seem very, very, very bilingual. There is often a stronger language in areas, and it will do the same thing as happening in India or African countries where this is the norm between tribes or between regions of the country. For just general conversation, but it will maybe at a higher, more educated level because they've studied maybe in all the languages. Okay, I'm open to other questions as well. Okay. Yeah, please.
Hello.
Hello.
You said that to your mind, the second language was the most difficult, and then after that, it got easier. I actually thought perhaps the third language was the challenge, because this is the point at which you consolidate how to learn a language.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. And it's kind of when I said it, I kind of went, ish, and sort of winced a little bit, because it's true that the first is the hardest in terms of that mental barrier of understanding how to speak and communicate in a different language. And that's the one thing that you do once, in terms of that mental flip. But you're right, and this happened to me. Well, I started off with the Romance languages, and that was my first group of languages. And when I started learning Germanic languages, I had Swedish for my first Germanic language, naturally. So I had Swedish at university, but I didn't have German at school at all. I spoke no German until I was 22. And never studied it. But Swedish I found more similar to English because of the structure and the way it was flowing. The putting the definite article at the end was a bit weird, but it was more or less okay. When I got to German and this whole flipping the sentence round and putting verbs at the end of the sentence, yeah, we do it in English as well sometimes, but in German the way of doing it was a bit of a mind flip. And for me there was a real, I would describe it as a physiological change in my brain from the Romance language set to the Germanic. And once you go through that change, there's no going back. And so that's kind of what I'm getting at with the first one's the hardest, because that going forwards and then not being able to go back from understanding that and visualizing speaking another language, that's why I say it's the hardest. But there's definitely struggles with each new family, because there are new ways of thinking that change completely, and you have to make that flip again.
Interesting that you should mention German, I think, because that was actually my third language. It's sort of like tasting from the tree of knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you.
Great presentation, loved it.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, I'm Italian, I'm not a native English speaker.
Va bene.
Benissimo. But I've lived, before I lived in Finland, and now I've been living in Lithuania, and I like this the concept of dominance, that I use English, to dominate conversation, because both Lithuanian and Finnish are not very strong. But I also found out that Lithuanian and Finnish, they're not used to people speaking their language as a second language. Yeah. So for them it's very awkward. And when I tried to learn Russian in Lithuanian, for me it was way easier to practice Russian, because Russian, as Italian, I think, they're used maybe to see other people struggling, so themselves they're used to adapt in a way to somebody speaking their language as a second language. So my question is, how can we help these societies maybe to open their eyes and to realize that, look, there are lots of people that would love to speak your language, and what can you do, natives, to... Yeah,
this is really true. As an English language native, we're used to a huge wide variety of different accents and people from different cultures speaking our language. So our ear can tune in and can adapt quite quickly. And a lot of other smaller countries where they're not used to people learning the language. And I live in a country exactly the same. In the Republic of Macedonia, people didn't really study Macedonian, and there aren't many that speak it well, now from abroad that come in. And I remember when I first went there, and I went to a school to try and learn Macedonian that way, to have proper lessons. And they went, yeah, we've taught really successfully beyond the basics. We've got this American guy who's been learning for 2 years. He's fantastic. But he calls and we don't understand a word he says. But it's because of the accent. How you can combat that? It's tough. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to make this presentation, because I know it will go on YouTube, and I know that within the community, people will see it and they'll understand the struggle, and it's taking the time to be patient and listening to it. And sometimes I find it quite hard to understand why a native can't bend their ear a little bit to understand, but it does seem to be something that's pre-programmed. And how you would do it, I think, is just with actually making people more aware that this is okay to do, and getting more used to people learning the minority languages. And you, as a foreigner living in Lithuania, speaking to more people in Lithuanian, so that then, because you are an ambassador for foreigners speaking Lithuanian, when you learn any language, you're then an ambassador for a foreigner learning that language. And that's how you need to see yourself. So don't get scared when they reply to you in English or in another language that you may speak. Just, be uporen, as you say, just carry on and actually stand by what you're trying to do and represent.
So, hi, Richard, thank you for the great talk. I would like to dig into a little bit about this distinction between multilingual and polyglots. And we've had this conversation before. I self-identify as a multilingual. I call it accidental polyglot. But
I like it.
But for the sake of clarity, I would call them circumstantial language, or circumstantial polyglot, or intentional polyglot. And I find, as a circumstantial polyglot, I would love to be intentional polyglot. And from what I've heard from many intentional polyglots, how they manage to become how intentional polyglots manage to become intentional polyglots is they trick themselves into being circumstantial polyglots. They create environment, they create necessity, includes the things that you mentioned yourself. These are all the different reasons people learn languages. So I think maybe the distinction really isn't that clear, and there's a lot of back and forth between the two domains. Yeah.
I agree that this isn't a clear distinction. It's just something I perceive, and I wanted to express in a public way, because this is a shift in my thinking. More recently, actually, I'd probably say in the last year or so, I've started making this distinction in my head, and I think it comes from people asking, "Am I a polyglot?" And probably, yeah, and there's probably a crossover. It's like when people talk about being as agnostic theist and atheist. You can actually be an agnostic theist and an agnostic atheist. It's not one or the other. It's all, and I think probably this may fit into that kind of category of you could be a multilingual polyglot. Why not? I said there's one person from Luxembourg who I would define as that. A natural multilingual because of environment and because of heritage, who then also went on to learn other languages.
Hi, Richard.
Hello.
Just behind him. Thank you so much for this presentation. I wanted to ask you, since I'm a native English speaker from America, and there's several of us in the room now, which is great, I think, it's amazing. I was wondering if you have experienced, or if you could share with us any psychological boundaries or obstacles you've faced being a native English speaker. Because I know for Americans, there's a reputation around the world for being either unable or unwilling to learn other languages. And so it kind of comes to my mind every now and then, well, you're American, so you're supposed to have these problems. Have you experienced anything like that?
Yeah, kind of. I suffer the thing that I think many of us native English speakers suffer, in that you take this time and you make this effort to learn languages, but actually the picking the language is very difficult because there's not always a natural language to pick. And it doesn't matter how many you pick, you're still then a native English speaker when you go to the country that you don't speak the language of. And you still feel lazy. And you still feel that you're representing a stereotype. And I definitely feel that as well. When I go to, when I go to Hungary and I just know a few words, I feel, oh, why can't I just speak Hungarian? But then you think, well, I can't do this in every single country in the world either. And that's, for me, one psychological barrier. Potentially not what you were getting at with your question, but one of the things that for me is an important thing sort of linked to that idea. In terms of people's reactions, yeah, I've certainly had, in the Netherlands when I lived there, the first 6 months were very hard for speaking Dutch because I didn't have the vocabulary to say everything I wanted, and I didn't have maybe the right grammar, and maybe my accent was a bit off, and I don't know, I don't worry too much about accent, to be honest. I like to be able to be clear in my pronunciation if I can, But after the 6-month period of people constantly turning back to English, it started to ease off. But if ever it got to a point where I went to buy tickets or anything, then I had to show my passport to write my passport thing. They go, oh yeah, we were speaking in Dutch for like half an hour about where I'm going to fly to and what I'm going to do and what I needed. And they go, oh, so you're from the United Kingdom, huh? Yeah, en ik heb mijn Nederlands eigenlijk niet vergeten. And I can still speak Dutch, I haven't forgotten it. Just because I gave you my passport and it says I'm British does not mean that I can no longer speak Dutch. And they went, oh, sorry hoor. But it's a natural thing that you get as a native English speaker. People like to speak to native speakers. It's just the way it is. I mean, it's a rare thing for a lot of people, a lot of communities. So they go, oh, you're from the US, or you're from the UK, or you're from Australia. Wow, we can practice English with somebody who speaks it really well. You know, don't judge me on that. Could be awful. But it is an issue, and I think it's being polite and saying, you know, yeah, if you know, it's really good that you want to speak English. It's great. You know what? I really like your language, and I really like your culture, and I'd love to speak to you and actually improve. And most people are actually quite nice when you say that. You know, I've taken the time to come here. It's really nice if you could carry on in your language so that I can improve. And that's kind of what I do. That's my trick when I first go to a country. Even if I know they speak better English than I speak their language. I don't think that should be an issue. I think it should be a language etiquette thing, and that takes me back to the language etiquette. Because I think that even if people aren't aware of that themselves, you can you know, sort of passively show that there's a language etiquette here. This is the boundary. I've come to your country, and I've come for the reason of learning your language. So therefore, please do me that favor and speak to me in your language.
Hello.
Hello.
This is relating to what you said about language etiquette. One situation that always feels really awkward to me is being on an airplane, especially if it's like a Japanese or Chinese airline and everybody around me is Asian. And so, of course, the flight attendants take one look at my face and they speak to me in English. This always makes me feel just really awkward because I don't want to be like, you know, the foreigner on the plane who needs to be spoken to in English. And my instinct is to reply to them in their language. But at the same time, I don't want to make this person feel bad, you know, feel like maybe their English isn't good enough, and I know, you know, they're only doing their job. It's only natural for them to think that, you know, I would prefer to speak English. And so I'm just wondering if you have any sort of protocol for this type of situation.
Okay, a good question. I think if they're very short interactions and you know that it's not going to become a conversation, depending on how confident you feel or how uneasy you feel about the situation, you could do one of two things. Just say, okay, I'm just going to say something back in English and be done with it. Or you could say it in English and then say something nice like thank you or just a couple of words in that language after the English to show that you have an awareness of their culture and their language. And that might spark a reaction in return, that they say, oh, you've learnt some Japanese or you've learnt some Chinese. That's really nice. And then you go, and you say, oh yeah, I studied it, blah, 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 blah. And it may spark a tiny conversation. In those situations, it's unlikely to spark a huge dialogue because it's a plane ride, right? And they've got a job to do and they're doing their job to the best of their ability. And if they went up to every person on the plane who was white or black and just randomly spoke to them in Chinese or Japanese, they'd probably make more enemies than friends. They'd be like, what the hell? You know, and it is the language of the sky. English is used in the sky, so they're trained to make the announcements in English. So there's kind of that mindset going on in that specific environment. But that's what yeah, but that's I mean, it's a natural thing to do, right? I mean, where the only sort of languages where you wouldn't do that is English, because anyone can be British, anyone can be American. It doesn't really depend on your outward appearance, because we're all mixed, right? But how many white Japanese people do you see? You just don't come across them. It's not. So it's not the. Yeah, there we go. We've got one in the back there. But you don't get that many, and so it's fair. It's fair enough to do. I mean, I get that every day, pretty much in the Balkans. People look at me, and I'm too white to be Balkan. I am. I mean, you know, it's like I went around with. I'm sure Danny won't mind me saying this, but I went around Skopje with Danny Ferguson, and Danny Ferguson is as black as I am white, and we went round, and it was like the circus had come to town. Everyone's heads were turning. Who are these people? And then, you know, we started speaking in Serbian, which freaked them out even more. These policemen went, "They're speaking Serbian." What's going on? The world's gone crazy. But it was.
Sorry, time's up, Richard.
Yeah?
Sorry, yeah, we have to finish.
Oh, sorry, okay. I can't see where you are. Okay, thank you. Thank you.